Explains. Now, you see, Gerry, though, is a Western Canadian born and bred, being raised in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and you'll see in a moment why this fact of biography is rather important. He spent his graduate student years here at U of T, happily, under the supervision of Ramsay Cook before he left for York, and Carl Berger, both of whom were from Manitoba. And evidently, the story goes, they encouraged him to study what he loved best, and that was the evolution of Western Canadian history. In a way, he never looked back. Gerry spent 50 years teaching at the University of Manitoba, offering courses that range from first-year history to labor history classes for union members. While he supervised over 40 graduate students, he mentored many more. He held visiting appointments at McGill, Yale, the Free University in Berlin, Cambridge, and Sydney. His research publications include many books on Canadian prairie regional history, ethnic diversity in modern Canada, and one I like entitled Citizens and Nation, an essay on history, communication, and Canada. He's also edited numerous studies on topics such as rural life and Winnipeg social history. A winner of the Royal Society of Canada's Tyrrell Medal, as well as being a fellow of the Society, Gerry was awarded the Order of Canada in 2022 and has been honored with one of the Canadian Historical Association's Lifetime Achievement Awards. Now today, he's going to talk to us about his latest, his most recently published book, which brings together, as we'll hear, so many of his scholarly interests. The book and the lecture are entitled The Honourable John Norquay, Indigenous Premier, Canadian Statesman. But if you'll permit me, I'd like to end my introduction by quoting some of Gerry Friesen's own words. These struck me very forcefully when I read them, and I read them recently in our difficult political times, nationally and globally. So I cite, "In reading history, we make sense of the world. During difficult moments for the country or for the world, it can often feel as though the values we are defending are mere abstractions. Revisiting and considering our history shows us how these principles, democracy, fairness, equality, for example, were pursued in the past and have meaning for us today." So please join me in welcoming the author of those wise words, Gerry Friesen.
So it's an honor to be here. I'm learning how to handle this mic. How we're doing? Is it working? Okay, good. And I'm here to talk about Manitoba, the prairies, and to a degree, the country. This is not just a Manitoba story, but the picture you see in front of you here is Manitoba 1870. And it sits in the middle of the story I'm going to tell. And I'm going to leave it there for a while I tell you part of the story. And then I'm going to show some more slides and explain why I think it matters to know something about a person who has been, I think, almost entirely forgotten in Canada and in Manitoba for that matter. There's a building named after him downtown in Winnipeg. There's a town in Saskatchewan. There's a mountain in the Rockies, a school in Vancouver. But I think I've been now to 3 of those 4 places. None of them knew much about Norquay, if anything. And yet, I'm going to argue today, as I've argued in this very fat book, that he's extremely important at this moment in Canadian history. So, though long forgotten, he's of both regional and national importance. His dates, 1841 to 1889. So basically, the 1870s and 80s are the period of his active life. He was born in the Red River settlement in St. Andrew's Parish, which was almost exclusively Métis, as we use the word today, meaning mixed European and Indigenous or First Nation ancestry. His grandfather, born around 1790s, late 1790s, was an Orkneyman. That's his father's side. His Norquay's mother's side, a great grandfather, was born in England and went to some of the highest ranks in the Hudson's Bay Company. So he comes from, obviously, fur trade, Western Canada, Orkney, English, First Nation, Métis family. He was a farmer, a hunter, in the way that people were in that mid-19th century in Red River. In 1870, when Canada annexed or took over Rupert's Land, as it was called, he was acclaimed from his parish as the first assemblyman from that parish in the first assembly in Manitoba. He rose to the cabinet within a year because of his obvious strengths. Within 8 years, he was premier. He was premier for 9 years, which is it's a long time. 4 elections, general elections, in which he was elected and re-elected premier. And then he died young at the age of 48 in 1889. But remember, life expectancy in mid-19th century Canada was about 50. So this isn't extraordinary to see him dying at 48 or 9. So those are my first ways of introducing him. I'd like to talk a bit about biography and why biography is important in this case. Then I'm going to show you these pictures to explain a bit about Manitoba. And then a few comments about why this is, I think, so relevant in 2025. Donald Creighton, my teachers, often talked about biography in our seminars. And of course, as the biographer of John A. Macdonald, it's not surprising. And he used the phrase more than once, character and circumstance. That's what one was supposed to capture in a biography. It's good words. Now today, the word more often used is identity. But character and identity, I think, are more or less the same thing. The language has changed. Sources for finding Norquay's character are obscure. And I've had a long quest in search of them. Understand that I graduated in the early 70s with my doctorate from here. And my doctorate was on prairie regional sentiment, distance from central Canada in the period roughly 1870 to the 1930s. Norquay figured in a small way in that story. So for the next 50 years, I tried to collect whatever came up on Norquay, hoping eventually something would turn up. I even started a biography of Norquay around 1980. And the archivist in Manitoba said, no, bad idea. The sources aren't there. Now, he was a family friend of Jean's and mine, and I trusted him implicitly. And so I moved on to other books. But it turned out he was negotiating secretly with a woman who was an historian and who had dedicated her life to John Norquay's memory. She was at that point, I didn't know this, almost 80 years of age and had been collecting materials for 45 years. She had received letters that had filled Norquay's office and then put in a trunk and given to the family. And the family gave the letters to her around 1946. And so here we are in the 1980s, and she was beginning to feel frail and decided to give them to the archives. And so our friend, the archivist, said, don't do this. But he wouldn't tell me why, because he didn't want to screw up this negotiation. In the end, he got it. But there were terms in the gift. The letters had to be microfilmed. Miss Cook, the woman, the historian, didn't want people to steal John A. Macdonald letters, for example. And if they were loose in an archive, one could imagine that happening. So she insisted in this gift that there be a careful accounting made of every letter and that they be microfilmed. And only then would they be put in the archives and on display. Well, you know what archives are like these days. They don't do that kind of work anymore. And so, they expect you to put your papers in a box and to label the box and to create the list. And Miss Cook was by this point quite elderly and could not. And it took about 20 years for the archives to finally get the filming done and to put the letters on the shelf and the film in the library. And because I was the first to insist that I'd love to see them, they let me see the originals and to go through the originals, which has been a real advantage. And I spent 3 years basically transcribing them, because the one problem with them was that Norquay had a desk about as big as this wall with pigeonholes, and he died suddenly. And so what were they going to do? They just took the letters in piles out of the pigeonholes, tied a pink ribbon around them, and put them in a trunk. And so it would be like throwing of papers on the floor in terms of organization. It wasn't even by year. It was, so I had to essentially index them again. But I had an index to all 4,000 of these letters. And Miss Cook, over that period, had also transcribed 4 letter books. You know, the onion skin kind that they wrote, and then they fold the page over and the ink would be transferred to the other page and the letter would be sent on. She typed 1,000 of Norquay's letters. So that was a base. Having decided that I could write something out of these papers as I read them, I didn't know originally I'd write a biography, but I hoped I could. I kept on looking. And the second major source in this book, I don't know if you've heard much about it, the John A. Macdonald papers in Library and Archives Canada are an incredible resource. Over 100,000 letters by and to him. And they are something. They're also microfilm, but they're also now online. And so you can actually just sit down at your desk and read as many as you want, and they are indexed. And so you can find your way through them very quickly. And that was a second major source. The third, when I was starting out and the archivist hadn't yet told me not to do it, I was looking seriously at Norquay, and I went to the Canadian Pacific Railway, which then had a big office in Windsor Station in Montreal. And they had an extraordinary archive. I don't even know if they allow people in anymore, because they've transferred the head office to Calgary. And now with Kansas City, I don't know where those papers are. But I read CP papers and learned something about George Stephen, the president of the CPR in the 1880s, the builder of the CPR. And what I learned was that he was a very, very slippery character. And that was important. Learning that, and then in 2011, 2012, 2013, when I got into the Norquay papers, I decided, and Jean agreed with me because she had reasons to research in Minnesota, we would go to St. Paul, Minnesota, to the Minnesota archives, because there are the James J. Hill papers. And Hill is one of the greatest of the American railroaders. And he built a railway essentially from Chicago to Seattle over time, the Great Northern. And his papers are incredible. And in those papers are not many of value to me. They told me how difficult it is to manage the building of a railway. It's an extremely challenging issue in the 1880s. But there were two letters from George Stephen, well, telegrams, really, telegrams from George Stephen that I think clarified something I would never otherwise have been able to understand. And I'll maybe tell you an ounce or two of it before I quit. But that was another basic source. And finally, I don't know how to put this. In England, there are letters from a bishop who was the first bishop of Red River. He arrived in 1849, stayed till 1864. And so he was the bishop, the Anglican bishop, for half of the Red River community, the Anglican half. There's a small Presbyterian group and a larger Roman Catholic group. And he's important in the Norquay story. And it turned out that Lambeth Palace archives, there are letters from this man, David Anderson, and they make a difference to my understanding of what was going on. And they supplemented something that we found in the Cambridge University archives. The Royal Commonwealth Society closed its London offices on Northumberland and sold the library, and a Canadian Weston family foundation bought them and placed them in an extension to the Cambridge University Library. And so one of the best libraries on the empire, 1800 to 1940, is in Cambridge. 300,000 published items along with other stuff. And among those items is David Anderson's main sermons from 1849 to 1864. There are 12 of them published annually, more or less, ranging from 30 to 50 pages. But they tell us a lot in conjunction with the letters about David Anderson. And so those are the basic sources upon which I've written this book. And you'll think it's a fat brick, and somebody has called it that. But you'll understand a little more why when I tell you now a bit about the story. So first about biography. The quickest way, if you've never looked at biography, to get a sense of it is to read a little book by Hermione Lee called Biography, A Very Short Introduction. A delightful book, I think, with some wisdom in it, a lot of wisdom in it. One of the things she says, I should explain that my son believes in saving paper. And so this is on two sides of the paper. And so I've got to make sure I'm telling it the way it should be. This is Lee, the telling of life stories is the dominant narrative mode of our times. That's a dramatic statement, but it's an interesting one. And I've been learning a bit about it well after I started writing this biography. What I've been learning is that if you go to a bookstore these days, any big bookstore, you'll find the biography takes 2 or 3 of the big shelves. It's right up there with teenage girls' fiction. If you haven't take a look, do the geography of a major bookstore. So I've been paying attention to biography and did in the last years as I was finishing it. I went to a book launch in Cambridge for a book by Richard Evans. German history is his field, but he has written 2 biographies recently. And at that book launch, he said every historian should at least once write a biography. They're very instructive, he said. Pinpoint accuracy in factual detail, or you've lost the narrative. Master the many forces shaping a personality. In Italy, he said, these are challenges that will influence the historian's thinking ever after. So I've been following Evan's comments since his biographies and found one from The Guardian this summer. The recent biographical boom, quote, coincides with the rise of strongmen and would-be dictators in Europe, and also, of course, more recently in the United States. So it's become urgently important to study why people, again, at every level, have started to depart from democratic norms. And so the argument, obviously, he's making is that you've got to study these people very closely. As it happened, Gene and I went to a talk not so long ago where a fellow from the Brookings Institution was describing the speeches of Donald Trump over the last not 5 or 10 years, but 45 years, and saying how much of the pattern is coherent. This isn't a man with random thoughts. This is a man who's got consistent thoughts. What Richard Evans is saying, I think makes sense to me. So Donald Creighton said we should look at character. He also said we should look at circumstance. And here I've got a little quote from Hermione Lee, but it's a writing of Virginia Woolf. Woolf was planning to write a memoir, never did finish it, but she said, quote, I see myself as a fish in a stream, deflected, held in place, but cannot describe the stream. Now that's a classic. Marshall McLuhan picked that up, as it happens, but I suspect this is where he picked it up. It's a good way of thinking about what I had to do in my book and what any biographer does. It's you have to pay attention to the stream equally with the fish. So Norquay is my fish. The stream is Canada, basically 1840 to 1880, British North America and Canada, but particularly Canada in the 1870s and 80s. Norquay's career intersected with many enduring points of stress in Canadian life. It coincided with the ambitions of French-speaking Roman Catholic Quebecers who sought to preserve and extend their presence in Canada. His relationship with John A. Macdonald, and especially Macdonald's championing of the Canadian Pacific Railway, was a central factor in Norquay's entire career in politics. Norquay's personal thinking about the Western world's economic principles, markets, private property, the role of the state, was part of the Prairie West's transition from the fur trade barter and self-sufficiency to an export-driven farm economy. And in today's reconciliation moment, Norquay was Indigenous, as we see it today. A person of mixed First Nation Orkney Scot ancestry who differed radically from Louis Riel in his outlook and for whom the ideas embedded in the concept of settler colonialism, the term so frequently used today, found only some resonance. So I'm going to be talking about those general themes over the course of this. But first of all, I'd like to talk about the family and the Norquay I came to know. His mother was born around 1820, possibly 1819, baptized in 1821. So we know that date for sure. She was 13 when she married, gave birth to 6 children over the next 10 years, two of whom died very early, and lived with her husband as a fur trade, at a fur trade post, and then on a Red River farm. She died at the age of 24. Aside from church records of birth, baptism, sorry, I should say baptism, marriage, and death, and letters to her from her great grandmother, two of them, from a fur trade post, there is no other record of Mrs. Norquay. Norquay's father was a laborer in the fur trade, and there are fur trade records that deal with his career. One of them in the British Columbia archives, a Hudson's Bay Company post, northern Manitoba, York Factory as it's called, north of the end of Lake Winnipeg. The officer writing the journal recorded that John's father spent weeks at a time in the fall and winter months cutting trees and sawing them into planks, while living not in the fort, but in a tent buried deep in the forest with half dozen other laborers. The products of their work would become palisades for the fort and planks in the York boats that carried the Hudson's Bay Company goods. In that cold, snowbound environment, Norquay Sr. worked side by side with half a dozen First Nation laborers, all of them Cree, probably, learning a good deal about their worldview, their dreams, setting up the work discipline that was necessary, learning and then using the Cree language, because they would have been his companions for weeks and months at a time. Mr. Norquay was the only employee in that group or team whose name was recorded in the journal. The other 5 or 6 were simply people who worked and received goods at the fort when they came in. For my purposes, though, a key insight comes from the work environment. John's father lived until John was 8 years old. By this point, they had family lived on a farm in Red River, in the parish that John was born in. John would have learned, one expects, Cree from his father in the first instance. He would have learned First Nation relations, one imagines. He would have learned social equality in Red River, one imagines. And so that's what we know about John Norquay's father. End of story. The next phase of John's life, after his father died at 8 years of age, is absolutely unknown. Possibly he could have been with his grandmother immediately, or he may have moved to her house, which would be about 5 miles from his birthplace, when he was about 8 or 9. But what's clear is that he was in a parish school, and it turned out that John was one of the best students in not only that school, but in all of Red River. Bishop Anderson, about whom I spoke, decided in 1850, the second year in Red River, that he would create a scholarship for the best student, or if he could get some more money, the best 2 students in all of the Red River parishes, to take them into a college that he would build in Red River. He did so. John won the scholarship easily in 1853 or 4, and for the next 3 or 4 years was taught in St. John's Collegiate School, which was a step well above the parish schools. Now I'm going to talk a little about this school. You might imagine that it would be a relatively, low level of education. But in fact, John studied Latin and Greek 4 kinds of math, history, biblical history, and turned out to be doing very well in all of the subjects. He was picked out by Anderson in a letter Anderson wrote to a student here at U of T, another graduate, as being the best of all of his class. 3 of John's Norquay's colleagues as students went to Cambridge. A 4th graduated here at U of T. So the collegiate school, Anderson once described as the equivalent of an Oxford or Cambridge prep school. And so the education he had was exceptional in Western Canada terms and not bad, reasonable in Ontario or English terms. And that matters for what comes later. Now, Bishop Anderson, through those sermons and his letters, provides a pretty clear picture of how he saw the world and I suspect, but I don't know, how he taught his students. He talked about personal discipline, that we know for sure from his letters, about the church, about the British Empire, about race and how to regard Indigenous First Nations. He talked about the Red River community and the rules of which should be accepted there. John Norquay would have heard all of these because these were sermons delivered in a Red River pulpit. In fact, in the pulpit of St. John's Collegiate School. Anderson, and I'm quoting now, did not believe in the race that people were developing as a concept in the 19th century. He believed instead, and this is a quote from one of his sermons, God has created all of one blood. Anderson said in his first charge to the clergy at Red River, quote, "We all behold the Indian. We gaze upon him as a fellow creature, possessing the same immortality as ourselves. We notice him as he passes, and he gives and receives the usual salutation of his countrymen. He proceeds onward and thinks that God has created different races for different ends, and that an insuperable barrier divides the white from the red man. That's what the Indian thinks. And Anderson thinks just the reverse, that we are all of one blood. Anderson believes that the only problem he faces is finding a language to communicate his perspective to the First Nations and the Métis with whom he's working. Anderson saw the Métis as essentially potential whites, potential Britons, who would require a little education, stability, before they could finish, before they could become, I should say, proper Britons. I'll leave it at that for Anderson. One other document of importance. I've spoken about my sources, and Miss Cook had an amazing collection of sources on her own, and one of them came from interviews with Norquay's children. And one of those interviews was a throwaway line. Andrew Norquay, then aged 74 or so, living in Vancouver. Miss Cook went out to Vancouver to interview him and kept handwritten notes of the interviews, learned that John's classmates, John Norquay's classmates, called him a merry, prankish youngster, which is a good start on a description. And they used the word roguis. Roguis. Now, what is that? It is rogue-ish, a rogue. But the boys who used the word said roguis because they were using Bungi, a dialect of English that you may not have heard about, but is it, am I doing that? I'll just go back for a sec. a dialect of English is partly Gaelic, partly Norn, partly Cree, partly Ojibwe, and a good chunk of English. And so judge becomes zuds, shoot becomes suit. There are new words. Kingfisher is a different word entirely. Skeeter isn't a mosquito, it's a kind of bird, and so on. And so Bungi as a dialect of English was what these kids were using and what Norquay grew up with. A man describing Norquay in 1885 said he speaks Bungi. It, in other words, this is a significant part of Norquay's existence. He learned standard English in Anderson's school, but he spoke the dialect to the people, was one of the people. So I'm going to shorten that part simply by saying this is a man who is a man of the people, a buffalo hunter, a farmer with 2 acres, a man who marries early, has children in Red River, and then acquires this political career. Now I'm going to go on and show you some of these pictures. That's what the houses look like. This is 1871, but it could be any time from the 1840s to 70s. Oxen in front, family in front of the door, possibly a glass window, possibly fish skin to let in the light. I don't know whose cottage it is, and the school would have been similar. That's the kind of structure they had. But this is St. John's Collegiate School. You can see it's on a whole other level, architecturally and also in the way it taught. The boys by their way there include probably 2 of Norquay's sons. This picture was taken in 1885. And I like the roguish nature of the bow and arrow in the front row. It's a nice touch. This is Norquay on the right, 1871 probably. Trim, newly politician. He's with his stepbrother, Andrew Spence, who figures prominently in his life right through the next 15 years. And the one thing to note, the moccasins on his feet. They're beaded. They would have been normal footwear in 1871. And it was often said about Norquay that he carried 2 extra pairs around with him for dancing because he wore them out. This is his wife. He married when he was 21. She was 19. She lived to be 91. She's about 40 in this picture, has had 7 children in the first 10 years of marriage, and then 10 years later had another who died within a year and a half. But this is Elizabeth. I should say, by the way, Norquay was 6'1" at a time when a tall man in Canada was 5'6" or 7. John A. was 5'11" and regarded as very tall. Norquay, therefore, was very big. At his largest, he also weighed 300 pounds, so he was a very large person. Elizabeth was a tiny one. This is a picture I like, a signed picture of Louis Riel, taken after he had been in a hospital in Quebec for 2 years, having had a breakdown in Washington. But he's on his way back to Montana at this point, where he marries, has a couple of children, and is a school teacher in the early 1880s. This is the Forks in Winnipeg. And the reason I've got it here is partly to convey why Winnipeg's where it is. The Forks are still a big deal. Skating right now is happening. But the other point of the picture is the steeple, the church. That's the headquarters of Roman Catholic Francophone Western Canada for the next century. There's a Grey Nuns residence, a hospital at that point, a college, the cathedral, the Bishop's Palace, and then the business district of St. Boniface. And so to think about Manitoba in the 1870s, one has to think about a bilingual, bicultural community. Norquay invented something new in 1879, and that is what you would call today Team Manitoba. Delegations that would conduct expeditions to Ottawa to lobby. He's here with his son in 1880. Horace was then 10. He went on to go through St. John's Collegiate School and then became a doctor and had a wonderful career in Prairie, Canada. Norquay, you can see how much larger he is in 8 years, led these delegations, about 12 in 9 years, to Ottawa, to dance, to sing, to play cards, to go to the Governor General's residence, and basically to make a splash because Manitoba had been placed far behind the other provinces in its powers. And so he was conducting a diplomatic campaign for 9 years and was very successful at it. Now this is Winnipeg, 1887, Main Street, looking north. City Hall is the tall spire in the middle. You can see streetcar tracks, sidewalks, telephone poles and wires. It's obviously a very modern city, 1887. A city of 20 to 25,000 people. Oops, wrong way. This is the same chunk of street 6 years earlier. Now this is the period of Norquay's premiership. So you can see what a difference that same street represents. To look at that compared to that. This was when Western Canada was founded. This is Brandon in the same period. You can see the heart of Brandon is elevators and a railway. 2,000 people, the beginning of a second city. The Brandon is the center of a gigantic farm district that has just exploded out of nothing in 6 years. But there's only one railway in the beginning, the CPR, and one railway south that the CPR has bought, meaning that freight rates are controlled by one company. What's worse, that company negotiated a monopoly clause in their contract. There would be no line to the United States for 20 years under the CPR contract that John A. Macdonald negotiated. A guaranteed monopoly. You can understand why the farmers of Western Canada were so upset with the CPR in that period. Now, this is the other part of Winnipeg. The legislature is the largest building, a brand new legislature as of 1884. It was replaced 35 years later. And beyond it, Government House, which still sits there. There's a government precinct, as you can see. And in the corner, you can see troops, because the cavalry have stables behind the legislature there. And this is post 1885, after the troops have arrived in Western Canada and there's now a permanent presence. National politics. John A. is sitting there in a lovely coat. And Charles Tupper is here on the right. Behind Tupper, also sitting, is John Henry Pope. People don't know anything about Pope anymore, but again, those three constitute the crucial center of the Macdonald administration. And while Macdonald is the figurehead, Tupper is the brains and the best, most able of those political leaders. And Pope is the guy who does all the hard work, the actual administration. Now, why would they be sitting in this way? Norquay on the far left and William Meredith, Conservative Party leader of Ontario, standing in the center. What's going on in this picture? And the answer is that Ben Goff, the cartoonist who created it. This is Grip in 1886. Figures John A. is dying soon. John A. at this point is 71. And Ben Goff is saying, here are the two guys who are going to be the next prime minister, Norquay or Meredith. Another man picture. Front row is all that matters. And even there, I'm not sure you care, but Blair on the right, next to him looking sideways, Honoré Mercier, the Premier of Quebec. In the center, dominating proceedings, Oliver Mowat of Ontario. Next to him, Fielding of Nova Scotia. And on the far side, on the left, John Norquay, looking larger than ever. So this is a crucial moment too in the history of Confederation. It's the first time premiers have got together, October 1887, to try and alter the actual constitutional arrangements that John A. has established 20 years earlier. They're unhappy with the centralization that John A. has created, and they're trying to build an alternative model. And Norquay is part of it. So this is the book, the cover, and that's Norquay at his best, I think, a lovely picture of him. And this is one of 70 cartoons that appeared over a period of 5 years when Norquay was at the center of Canadian politics. Now, how are we doing on time now? Good? Good. Because now I want to talk about what it all is about, what it means. Hermione Lee, in that little book that I like, said that a biography, if it's to have some value for the reader, should open our minds to lives very unlike our own. Then it has an educational purpose. It's a branch of history and of knowledge. So while Gordie Howe may be the prime biography subject on some shelves, I think Norquay and MacDonald and Riel and these others should also be important subjects. So the times, the 1880s, John A. wins elections in 1878, 1882, 1887, 1891. And the period, therefore, of that 13 years is one of the two key periods that make MacDonald the so-called founder of Canada, the statesman of Canada. Richard Gwynne calls him nation maker. And we think of him too often, I believe, as almost a saint. And John A. wasn't a saint, as you know. I'm not talking about drink here. I think he gave up drink for most of that last 12, 14 years, much less than he had before. Before, he was often very much in trouble. But after 1878, not so. But it doesn't, having said he's not an alcoholic, or if he's an alcoholic, but he's not in trouble with alcohol in these years, doesn't make him a sweet and purposeful man. He's a sensitive, smart politician. And so that's what our picture of Norquay helps to clarify. Where he's cruel, where he's lying, and where he's great as a political figure. So what are the themes we can talk about in relation to Norquay and Canada and MacDonald? Well, the first is indigeneity. We would say today that Norquay is indigenous. I'm not sure that Norquay would ever have said he was indigenous. He believed he had become a British subject. He believed he was the equal of anyone else in Canada. When others treated him in racist terms, you can see hints for example, in assembly debates, where he objects to language. Breed, somebody used the word breed, and he repeats it and clearly doesn't like it. Norquay was not a Riel. Louis Riel believed the Métis could be a nation. In fact, were a nation. And his Louis Riel is now a saint for these Métis nation builders today. The Manitoba Métis Federation arrived in the airport in Winnipeg, and there's a poster as big as that wall saying, Red River, welcome to the Red River Métis Nation. Their assets are now in the $300 to $400 million range, and that's appropriate for correcting wrongs. But we've got to figure out what we mean by Métis. You know that in Ontario, it's a whole other crisis. You know that Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC is each creating their own Métis nation now. So the country has changed. But Norquay's Métis nation wasn't a Métis nation. Norquay's nation was Canada. An interesting alternative. So that's one story that I see in this. The second has to do with the French fact in Canada. Norquay stood at a moment of crisis in French relations with Western Canada. He fought bitterly, in a way, against the man leading the French in Western Canada, Joseph Royal. And he won. Norquay won. Royal tried to throw him out of the office of premier in 1879. Norquay rallied all the English in the assembly and defeated Royal. And as a result, Norquay stayed as premier, and Royal moved on to be a member of the House of Commons and later a lieutenant governor of the Northwest Territories. But the loss of French, what would I say, accommodation in Manitoba made a huge difference to those potential immigrants, all of whom were filtering south as a result, through Maine to Massachusetts, to the mills there. And so Western Canada lost that French fact, partly in 1870 perhaps, but certainly in 1879. And the accident was not caused by Norquay, but he took advantage of the situation to remain premier. A third comment, or theme that I would pull out of this story is the West's relation to the rest of Canada. This is a tough one today, but it starts with Norquay. Norquay's battle was with that CPR monopoly. He had enormous trouble with John A. as a consequence of that monopoly clause, but you find the same battle being fought over different topics right through the next 130 years. And so I can list them for you. Farmers, 1919 to 21, and they elected 60 members of parliament as a prairie protest. In the 1930s, the founding of new parties, the CCF and Social Credit. In the 1980s, the founding of the Reform Party. And of course, today, Mo and Daniel Smith talking about where we're shipping energy and the carbon tax. Those are all in the same pattern, and they build on each other, so that there is a tension, just as there is a French-English tension in Canada, so there is a West-East tension in Canada, and Norquay sits at the beginning of it. Danielle Smith sits in today's representation of it. Finally, one of those words that's become so prominent in academia today, I don't know if it's prominent in your own daily experience, settler colonialism. It's a big word or big phrase, and it creates a big problem for anyone. Now, the basic thesis, if you don't know it, essentially argues that, and I'm going to quote here, that there is an invasion or occupation of indigenous lands, and it amounts to a violent suppression, even genocide, for those indigenous people who are invaded. That is the essential theme of settler colonialism. It's an invasion and maybe a genocide. You can see, if you've been following the TRC discussion, why Murray Sinclair chose to modify the term and speak of a cultural genocide in relation to residential schools. Now, Norquay and settler colonialism. Well, my thinking is this. Norquay was part of Red River in 1869-70, a voter who selected representatives who went to Ottawa, negotiated the terms in which Canada took over Red River and made it Manitoba. The deal, the Manitoba Act, was brought back to Manitoba, considered in the Assembly in 1870, a representative assembly, and accepted. Now, Norquay quibbled about the terms, particularly the federal government ownership of prairie land and resources, and fought against it for the next 20 or 15 years. So he has a consistent argument against this particular Canadian annexation, but he and the people of Red River accepted the terms. At one point, Norquay says, at the point of a gun, but nonetheless, they accepted the terms. And so my argument back is that Norquay made a deal, became the bridge, accepted the markets, accepted the law, worked with the political parties. He became the bridge figure. Now, nobody knows enough about Norquay to say this, but I'm assuming pretty soon there'll be people saying nothing but a collaborator. And I can see the argument, but my reply is no, a bridge. This is a person who tried to work both sides, tried to hold the community together, and that's his role between 1878 and 1887. So that's why I think he's a Canadian statesman, not just an Aboriginal premier or Indigenous premier, but a Canadian statesman. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.